Will Pennsylvania decide the presidential election next year? Let's see next on Behind the Headlines.
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined for this show by Maura Donnelly, my co-host and an associate with the Susquehanna Valley Center. Maura, welcome.
Hello, Charlie.
Hi. Why, goodness, we can't turn on a television or a radio or look at a newspaper or magazine recently without hearing lots about the presidential race.
Already.
And it's more than a year away, Maura.
Exactly, yeah. It's a little overwhelming already.
Have you made up your mind yet?
No, I have not.
Okay. Well, we find that Pennsylvania is at the center of a firestorm here in Pennsylvania regarding the presidential selection process. Yeah. Pennsylvania has a very special place this particular cycle in the presidential selection process. And to find out why there is a firestorm, we have with us two of the leading authorities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on this issue. We're very happy to welcome to the show Charlie Gerow, who's the CEO of Quantum Communications in Harrisburg. Welcome, Charlie.
Good to be with you, Charlie.
And we have Dr. Jim Broussard, who is a professor of history at Lebanon Valley College.
Great to be here.
And I think you have another credential that's pretty important in this discussion, I think, Jim, and you're a very modest individual and don't necessarily share this that widely, but you're also the founding father of SHEAR, which stands for the
Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, Charlie.
So you are one of the leading authorities on early American history, and you're a very valuable treasure to Pennsylvania and to this discussion. Charlie, will you tell us why there is a firestorm here in Pennsylvania regarding the presidential elections of next year?
Well, you can call it a firestorm. I prefer to think of it as a healthy debate among the citizens of Pennsylvania and the members of the General Assembly over how we allocate our electors to the Electoral College. We're not talking about changing the Electoral College itself. We're talking about how we allocate our electors to the Electoral College. There are some folks that want to change the Electoral College. We'll probably get into that during this discussion. But Senator Dominic Pileggi, the majority leader in the Senate, supported by Governor Corbett and many other legislative leaders, are proposing that Pennsylvania go to what is known as the Congressional District Method of allocating electors, rather than the current winner-take-all system, which I think a lot of folks agree has some inherent inequities in it. But instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and getting rid of the Electoral College, this is a reasonable middle ground compromise that allows Pennsylvania to allocate its electors, one to each congressional district, the winner of the popular vote there, and two to the winner of the statewide vote. It's a fair system. It's a historically rooted system. It's the best system for Pennsylvania.
Now, Jim, we understand that Nebraska and Maine have been doing this for some years. This is not anything that is new, is it?
No, in fact, this is the way the founders assumed and expected that the Electoral College system would work. When they set it up, the thing they wanted to do most of all is to make sure that American people scattered all up and down the country would feel that they were part of the presidential selection process. So their idea was you would elect someone from your part of the state, that person would take your ideas and your preferences into the Electoral College, and you'd have a direct voice in electing the president. The problem is political parties sprang up and grabbed the system and decided that they were better off suppressing the voice of the minority in each state and gobbling up all the electoral votes of the state for the statewide winner. And things have gone downhill since.
Well, why is this suddenly an issue? I mean, I think there have been rumblings over the years about making some changes, but now it's really a big issue.
Well, I think it's a big issue right now, Maura, because people think it's actually going to happen. Okay. I mean, the Congressional District Method was proposed by Senator Joe Conte a decade ago in the wake of the Bush-Gore election of 2000, which a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle saw as a problem with the winner-take-all system, where a mere 500 votes, I mean, roughly the number of people that it takes to get elected to borough council in some of our smaller municipalities, tipped a national election because of the winner-take-all system. And so Senator Conte and then Senator Punt introduced a Congressional District Method plan back then, but it didn't go anywhere. A couple of years ago, a number of Republicans in the state house introduced the same plan, but again, it was destined not to go anywhere at that point. Now it is very apparent that with the support of the governor and a lot of impetus behind it and good common sense to boot, that it has a realistic chance of passing, and passing pretty immediately.
Well, because we have the support of the Republicans, it's being highly touted as a very partisan issue. What do you say to those that say it's all politically motivated?
Well, it is politically motivated in the sense that it's opposed by the state chairman of both political parties, because they know that the political bosses will have less power if this reform goes into effect, and the voters will have more. When it was put through in Maine, it was Democratic Senator Ed Muskie who was the leader pushing it. When it was put through in Nebraska, it was Democratic Governor Ben Nelson, now their senator, who signed it into law. And I'm just glad to see that the Republicans here are beginning to get on board that bipartisan bandwagon. I wish the Democrats would pay attention to their colleagues in these other states and hop on board also.
And interestingly, Jim, as you know, in Nebraska, a nonpartisan
That's
legislature,
right.
the only unicameral legislature in the country, a nonpartisan legislature put it through in Nebraska. So to say it's a partisan issue is really a misnomer, and frankly, it's the only fireback that some of the Democrats seem to have.
Well, Jim, going back to Nebraska and Maine, could you tell us a little bit about the history of the adoption in Nebraska and Maine, how long they've had it, what triggered it, and what this level of satisfaction has been with that in those two states since that time?
Well, let me give you a figure, Charlie. 11%. That's the percentage of Americans in a recent poll who have any confidence in Washington doing the right thing about national problems. People in Maine and in Nebraska both, a couple of decades ago, decided that they wanted to try to reduce the level of public alienation, increase the level of voter participation, and they would do that by, as one journalist in Maine said, getting as close as we could to the one man, one vote principle by dividing their electoral votes as we want to do according to congressional districts. And here's what's happened. In the decades since, one congressional district in Maine is a little bit more Republican than the others. In 2008, the Republicans put some serious resources into that particular district trying to win that electoral vote. They didn't do it, but it created a lot more interest in Maine and I think improved voter turnout. And the Democrats did the same thing with one district in Nebraska, and Obama actually did win that. And the Democrats there have said publicly it was that chance that they had to actually have their vote counted instead of being swamped by the statewide Republican majority that was responsible for a real uptick in interest in voter participation. And I think we'd find the same thing here because we are an even more diverse state, and it's even more important to let every group in the state in every area think and know that their votes matter and they're not just going to be submerged in some temporary statewide majority.
And Charlie, how do you respond to some of the major criticisms of this proposal that are floating out there? One criticism is that if Pennsylvania goes ahead and adopts this system, then Pennsylvania will not be as important in the presidential selection process. And the other criticism, which is that there will not be as much money coming into Pennsylvania from the presidential campaigns, and it will hurt us economically. How do you respond? What are the answers to those?
This is a family show, so I'll try to think of nice words to describe that. I mean, in all seriousness, Charlie said, look, nobody likes change very much. We all kind of resist it viscerally, and I think that's what you're seeing among the part of some of the political insiders that say those things. But the truth of the matter is that Pennsylvania is going to be more important, not less important, if they use the Congressional District Method. You're going to, instead of having campaigns concentrated in the big urban centers, most notably in Philadelphia, you're going to have the campaign spread out over the Commonwealth into the more suburban and rural areas where people haven't had their votes matter as much as the folks in the big cities. You're going to see the campaigns pushed out into districts where they don't very often see presidential candidates, where television advertising doesn't reach them. So there's going to be more money spent in Pennsylvania. There's going to be more attention placed upon the Commonwealth and on its residents across the board. It just won't be probably as concentrated as it has been historically in the big urban centers.
Well, I tend to have a problem with decisions being made on how much of a war chest is going to be spent here in Pennsylvania. And it sounds like they're going to need bigger war chests if they're going to have to be traveling to all these rural areas and buying television spots on,
No, you're absolutely right. You're not going to have one big election in Pennsylvania. You're going to have a bunch of smaller elections. And you're right, you'll be forced to pay more attention to areas that right now don't matter.
So it'll be spread out, but don't you
Right.
think there's something wrong with saying that we need to go in this direction because there will be more money spent here?
Well, we're not saying
We're
that.
not
We're
saying
not
that.
saying that at all.
Okay.
What we're countering is the notion that if we go this way, there will be less money spent. I got news for everybody. Regardless of which direction Pennsylvania goes in 2012, there's going to be a ton of money spent here. This is an electoral vote-rich state under any system of allocation. It is a popular state. It's a diverse state. It's going to be a battleground state regardless. The notion that Pennsylvania somehow becomes less significant or has, quote-unquote, less clout because they go to a congressional district method is hogwash.
The real question is this: after that contest and after all that attention and all that money is spent, how are people going to feel the morning after the election? Are they going to feel as they do now, that if they're in the very large minority, they get nothing? Or are they going to feel that we might have lost the state, but we get an elector because our area counted for something? You'll have more people satisfied, more people willing to say, all right, I see that the presidency means something to me, whereas before it didn't.
Additionally, Charlie, let me just bring up one other thing with respect to the question of clout for Pennsylvania. I don't think there are many political scientists or political operatives that would say that Pennsylvania doesn't have enormous clout in the nominating conventions of the respective parties. And yet, how do we select delegates in Pennsylvania to the nominating conventions? By the Congressional District Method. We don't have a winner-take-all system in either party. It's by congressional district. So, I mean, this notion that the Congressional District Method somehow diffuses the state to a point where it's less significant just doesn't wash.
There are a few individuals who have recently popped up with their own ideas, most surprisingly, perhaps, George Will. George Will. And, of course, Rachel Maddow has let her feelings be known about this. When this idea came out, how would you characterize Rachel's response?
Well, before we get to Rachel, let's talk about George Will. I mean, look.
Can I read a quote?
Well, sure.
Yeah,
then
let me
I'll
read a
tell you
quote.
about George
This is a
Will.
quote from George Will.
This is a quote from George Will, and because we've mentioned founding fathers several times, so this is the closing sentence that he has in a piece that he wrote recently. And he says, "The Electoral College today functions differently than the founders envisioned. They did not anticipate political parties," which I think is true, "but it does buttress the values encouraged by the federalism the framers favored, which Pennsylvania and others should respect." He's going back and saying we need to respect our founding fathers.
Well, I'm going to let Dr. Broussard speak to that in just a moment, but look, let's understand George Will. He is a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan. So he is a tortured soul. And I mean, look, in all seriousness, I agree with George Will on very many things. On this one, he just happens to be just plain wrong. Dr. Broussard can lay out the case very, very well as a historian, but the founders wanted the Congressional District Method. I'll let Jim tell you why.
Well, in fact, the quote you read, I think, explains exactly why his larger article is wrong, because the Electoral College system is rooted in the idea of federalism. Unlike almost every other, even democratic country in the world, we don't have a unitary government with all power and all attention focused at the center. The states have a role to play. The states are sovereign in many respects, and part of their role is to choose electors to the Electoral College. And the problem that the Electoral College is running into recently is there are people who want to eliminate it, essentially, and go to one nationwide popular vote, which means no one's vote would matter except the one person in the whole country who puts the majority guy over the top. And what we're trying to do, I think George Will should approve, and that is to keep the Electoral College relevant by reforming it so that it can meet the needs of today's population better.
Well, one thing certainly I've seen as a political scientist over the years is that the Electoral College works, and we have been able to select presidents throughout our history, and we've done it in a stable fashion, and we've held our country together. And it's a recognition. The Founding Fathers didn't create a direct democracy. They created a federal republic of states, not of people. Many of my students are quite surprised to learn that the people don't elect the president, the states do. And the one Trojan horse in this, Charlie, if you talk about what Jim just brought up, the National Popular Vote Initiative. Would you please tell us exactly how that would work? Because it's interesting. And then what are the problems with that?
The folks that don't agree with you and Dr. Broussard and myself that the Electoral College is important and the clear and manifest wish of the founders for a whole lot of good and valid reasons that we probably don't have time in this show to discuss. The folks that want to get rid of that, because as one witness at the recent hearing said, we're beyond what the founders thought.
Oh, we're beyond.
He said that.
When did that happen?
Just last week.
Oh, okay.
When we got behind.
When did we go beyond?
But the folks that want to get rid of the Electoral College are faced with the very difficult prospect of the only legitimate and legal way to do it being by the constitutional amendment process, which is very long and drawn out and frankly not very successful. We don't amend the Constitution easily, nor should we. So what they've come up with is this scheme to have a compact among the states to basically do through the back door what they can't do through the front door, and to render the Electoral College meaningless by taking the electoral votes of the states various and pledging them to whoever gets the popular vote on the national level. It really is, as I say, kind of a backdoor approach to what they can't legally do through the front door. And there are a whole lot of reasons why the national popular vote is not the preferred alternative. It recognizes, though, interestingly, the problems inherent with the winner-take-all system. That's the one kind of piece of common ground.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that if we move to this new system of allocating the votes, that will be a further eroding? And do you think we'll be heading in the direction of one popular vote?
No, just the opposite, because the whole point of the national popular vote is the current system leads to a lot of alienation and frustration, and the reason for that applies equally well against the statewide winner-take-all system of electoral votes. What you want to do is end up the election the day after with more people than today saying, hey, my vote amounted to something, I had a role in this process. And you can do that if you go to a district-by-district method, because the majorities in each district, if you add them up, are going to be bigger than the one statewide majority.
And we see some, I'm confused when I see some folks come out with different positions on these different ideas. For example, former Senator Fred Thompson has come out in favor of the National Popular Vote Initiative. That makes me wonder, Dr. Broussard, about that finding from earlier in the year that said that the weakest subject for all American school children, Maura, is history. It's no longer writing, it's no longer arithmetic or science, it's history. And have we lost sight of our own history? And that's coming into play here, isn't it?
Well, obviously we have, when you have a college professor say, as he did last week, that the founders no longer matter. You know, I honestly would love to see him sit down at his desk and write a constitution better than the one Madison, Washington, and those fellows came up with a couple hundred years ago. I will say this about Fred Thompson, though: he was a great general in Hunt for Red October.
And on that note, we want to take a break, and we'll be right back after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
And welcome back to our concluding segment of Behind the Headlines in this discussion of the presidential selection process in Pennsylvania. Jim, we want to start out with you and ask you about, historically, what are some of the states that first adopted this or used this method, and why did they move away from it? If this is, was working well for them.
Well, at one point or another, you had over half of the first 25 or so states use the district method for picking electors. But to give you an example of why it faded, In 1796, when John Adams barely beat out Thomas Jefferson for president, Adams picked up one electoral vote in Virginia, which voted by districts. And the Democratic Republicans in Virginia decided they weren't going to let that happen again. So in 1799, they changed to a statewide vote. And sure enough, Jefferson won all the Virginia votes, even though that time Adams carried 3 or 4 districts.
But yet those people in Virginia wanted Adams.
Well, that's correct, and their voices were not heard. Same thing happened in North Carolina, where the Federalists elected some electors for John Adams in 1800 and for the Federalist candidates in 1808. And when 1812 rolled around, James Madison was facing a tough re-election, and the Democratic Republicans in North Carolina said, we're going to do the same as Virginia did and squash the minority voice and not let it be heard. So again, they switched to a statewide choice, and Madison, of course, got all North Carolina's votes in spite of a very strong Federalist showing.
It's almost tyranny of the majority to
Well,
have it on a statewide
it is,
basis.
and the same thing happened election after election until by the 1830s, by Andrew Jackson's time, the last of the district states was turned into the winner-take-all system. And it only popped up one more time in the 1890s when Michigan, for one election, switched and split its vote. And ever since then, until Nebraska and Maine, every state has said, we only want the majority's vote to matter. We don't care what the majority thinks.
Although interestingly, Charlie, several states already vote by the Congressional District Method because there are a good number of states that only have 3 electors. So they do it that way. And,
That's right.
But I think
That's
that's
a good
overlooked. I mean,
thought.
the small states are protected that way.
What about the criticism, Charlie? What about those people that say this method of allocating presidential electors by congressional district would be fine if all the states did it? How does one respond to
Well,
that?
I had one ostensibly bright commentator say this ought to be done on a national level so that all states do it at the same time. But of course, the Constitution is very clear and very specific in saying that it's a decision made state by state by state. And
We're back to
somebody has
federalism.
it is, and it's a great concept, and somebody has to lead the way. Nebraska and Maine have done it with some success, but until a large, diverse state like Pennsylvania does it, other states are not likely to follow. So we can be truly the trendsetter. We were in 1776. We can certainly be again in the early part of the 21st century by doing the right thing and using the Congressional District Method here in Pennsylvania, and I believe other states will follow. Several are prepared to do that.
One of the criticisms that I read of moving to this method would be that there would be more likelihood of a tie. And then have you heard that? I mean, but I would think that would be if every state was using this method, there might be. Have you heard anything like that?
Well, you can have a tie vote under current circumstances.
Yeah. Okay.
So no, it's not going to be any more likely than it would be under any other system.
The mathematical likelihood is the same, and
It
that's
didn't make
why
any
the House
sense,
of
yeah.
Representatives is there to break a tie or to decide the election if nobody gets the constitutional majority necessary to elect a president.
Well, we've talked a lot about, this responsibility was allocated to the states. What sort of process do we have to go through in Pennsylvania in order to put this new method into place?
It's really pretty simple, Maura. It's like any other piece of legislation. It has to pass the House and the Senate and be signed into law by the governor. It doesn't
No
require,
constitutional
does not
amendment?
require a constitutional amendment. It's very simple. It's done by statute. Interestingly, it can be undone by statute as well. So it is, in my judgment, likely it's going to happen. And if people talk to their legislators and say this is a good thing for Pennsylvania, my sense is that they're going to move on it relatively quickly.
And if people support this and support you in your efforts here, how can they get some more information?
They could
and
go to
become
our
involved?
website. That would be a great way to go. Take a look at what's there on the website. Dr. Broussard's testimony, Dr. Greenewald's commentary, both there for folks to see, and a host of other commentary from both Democrats and Republicans in support of the Congressional District Method.
You see that most coverage of this, media coverage up to this point, seems to have been against this particular proposal, pointing out all the troubles and potential pitfalls with it. Why was that the case, that this hasn't seemingly received even-handed media attention, Charlie?
What receives even-handed treatment from the media, Charlie?
You're so cynical.
Charlie, you have to remember the media obviously are part of the establishment in this state, and establishments, whether they are journalistic, political, or economic, never like reforms. And this is a reform that's going to empower people, and a lot of times the establishment folks whether they run newspapers or giant corporations or political parties, are afraid of what the unleashed people might do.
Well, you're getting a lot of support as you move forward here and as people become a little better educated about the issue. You want to tell us about some of the support that you have?
Yeah, Maura, it's really interesting. And education sounds somewhat condescending, but I think it's
No,
just
it's
as
true.
people familiarize themselves with the issue. I mean, the instantaneous reaction of some people is we don't want to change it. It's working just fine the way it is. But as they begin to
People
really,
are afraid to mess with the founding fathers.
And they're not messing with the
Well, I
founding
think they
fathers
think
with
they
the
are.
Congress. I think you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's one of the misconceptions that has to be laid to rest. And instead, let them fully understand that with the Congressional District Method, we're really going back to the intent of the Founding Fathers, but just to let them be at ease with the change that's being proposed. It is a major change. It is a significant change. And we all know that those things don't happen in the legislative process real fast sometimes. But as members of the General Assembly and as the public at large begin to look at this, begin to pick it apart a little bit, begin to fully understand it, support is growing. We have support from Democrats and Republicans. The former chief counsel of the House Democrats supports this plan. Judge Joseph Ted Doyle, one of the most respected jurists in this state, elected to the General Assembly as a Democrat, elected statewide as a Democrat, former president judge of our Commonwealth Court is for it. So, I mean, there are a number of people that are looking at this, taking an analytical view and saying this is the right thing to do for Pennsylvania. It's fair. It makes sure that every vote matters, and it has historical roots. So it preserves the intent of the founders while addressing all of the concerns that many folks have over the potential abuses of the winner-take-all system.
And if Rachel Maddow, by the way, would go ask her fellow Democrats in Nebraska and Maine, they would tell her they liked this system when they put it in, and they still like it today.
Yeah.
If this change is to take place in Pennsylvania, Jim, when must it occur by?
Well, it can occur, I guess, at any time up until the casting of the electors' votes. But obviously, in order to let people know that this is how we're doing it, it needs to be done as quickly as we can this year.
Yeah, my sense is, Charlie, that it needs, as a practical matter, not as a legal matter, but as a practical matter, it needs to be done this year. I think there would be hesitation if we get into the next year. It might not be fatal, but I think it would be more difficult to get it passed if we go into 2012. So I'm hopeful that it'll be passed in 2011.
Last 15 seconds, what are the chances of this passing, Charlie?
I think they're very good. We're very optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but very optimistic that it will pass.
No percentage here.
I'd say 70-30.
Okay. Jim?
I think Charlie's about right, and by the way, Fred Thompson, of course, was an admiral, not a general.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we want to thank you for watching us and for joining us for this discussion. We'll look for you again next week, and on that note, we'll see you then.